So if you are new with us, or maybe you haven't been in a while, you've been coming, we are looking in a series through the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. And we can say a lot of things about the book of Revelation. One of them is it's a strange book. It's a weird book. It's a hard book. It's a difficult book, especially in the chapters we're starting now. So we've done previously the first 5 chapters, and those weren't so bad, but now we start getting into the part that gets a lot harder. It's a place where oftentimes people reading through the book of Revelation simply stop because they're trying to figure out all these strange and bizarre symbols. It's also honestly a lot of places where preachers just stop because it's a hard with all kinds of symbols and all kinds of strange things going on. But we're going to try and make our way through that. But I want us to think about a couple things as we do that. One is to recognize that it is a book of symbols and images. And so one of the things that makes it hard is we don't know, generally speaking, the Old Testament the same way that John, who gave us this vision, he was given this vision by Jesus and he translated and puts it, he fills it with pictures from the Old Testament. Of all these books that come before Jesus, the prophets especially, and all these images, and they're all callbacks to that. They're all kind of a language. And so maybe you've gone somewhere and you speak the same language, you speak English, but you feel like you don't understand what anybody's saying because they use all these words. Maybe you go to a shop where there's a bunch of mechanics and they're talking about all these different kinds of tools, and they're talking about, well, I need a 1/2 inch and I need a flex head. You're like, I don't know what that is because you're not a part of that thing. Or you go to a symphony and you're listening to the orchestra and they're talking about different things going on, and you're like, I don't know what that is. And it's the same way with the book of Revelation, because we don't know the Old Testament. So all these images are taken from there. That's one of the things that makes it hard even to preach on a Sunday morning. Because if we were to stop and try and go back and explore every little Old Testament images, we'd get through 2 or 3 verses in a day. Because we'd look at a picture and we'd go back, well, that's from Zechariah, and it's also found in Isaiah, and here it is also over in Ezekiel, and we'd be looking at all these things to try and understand what's going on. But we're not going to do that. What I think is a better approach is to look at a big picture of what's going on, to look at the big picture of what's happening in the story here. And the other thing that makes it hard, one other thing, is the assumptions we have going into it. We have lots of assumptions we've been told about the book of Revelation. We've heard about the book of Revelation, and we come into assumptions. One is we think it's a chronological roadmap of the future. And so I want us to suggest that maybe there's a different way to read it. And again, this is what makes it hard, because if we were to sit and to try and map it all out, we'd be here all day. In some ways, the book of Revelation is better suited to sitting in a classroom, because there's lots of questions, lots of things, lots of back and forth, but I still think there's value in doing it. So we're going to jump in to what's going on here. And so as we're thinking about this and we're soaked in the Old Testament, I wanted to quote from Scott McKnight, a professor at Northern Seminary, formerly from North Park, and this is what he says about the secret to understanding the book of Revelation. So you all ready for this? He says, here's the secret. He said, here is the only secret. Here is the only secret you need to reading Revelation. This book is about the Lamb's final and complete defeat of the dragon and its Babylons and establishment of New Jerusalem. That's all you need to know. That's the secret to reading the book of Revelation, is it's about the Lamb's defeat of the dragon and all of its allies and the establishment of New Jerusalem. That's the secret to reading it. So we're going to look at what's going on here. So we're in chapter 6. And what we have to do is kind of set the stage, set the context for that. And by that we mean, what's the narrative flow? We've had 5 chapters before, and in the 2 chapters right before this, John has had a vision of heaven. And the main thing that he's seen there, the primary thing that we keep in mind, is at the center of everything is a throne. And on the throne is God and the Lamb. God the Father and the Lamb, who is Jesus Christ, this symbol of Jesus, the Lamb that was slain. We've just been singing about that. This Lamb, and that's at the center of all things. And we also learned in those same chapters that in the right hand of the one sitting on the throne, he's got a scroll. And this scroll represents God's plan for all of history, and it's sealed up with 7 seals. And everyone's wondering, who's going to open that? Is anyone worthy to open this scroll? Is anyone worthy to unfold God's plan to save all of creation? And they're looking around, and it seems like no one's there. But then the Lamb who was slain, the one who is worthy because he was slain, comes and opens and is able to open the scroll. And this is what we're going to see in these things, is what will happen as the seals are broken. And so we might have some questions, and this is why we have to pay attention that it's symbolic. Like, how in the world does a lamb open a scroll? I mean, we all know you need like something. So clearly we're not talking a real lamb here. And the other is, if it's a scroll with 7 seals on it, how much are you going to be able to see when you peel off the first scroll, first seal? Nothing. Which tells us it's a symbol, it's an image, it's a picture of what's going on. And it's about the work of Jesus and how God's plan is revealed. So as we read through, we're going to see God's plan unfolding. But we're also going to find, and this may be our word for the day, it's going to be confusing. Which is one of those things you think, Pastor got up and the first thing he said is, my sermon's going to confuse you. So if you walk away today confused, I'm not going to say I was successful, but if you walk away confused, don't be surprised. But I think we're going to see something going on. And so what I want us to do is look at these seals kind of quickly and then move on from the part that we didn't read today yet. So we first of all have, and this is why I've got it, so there's a printout there with the scripture in it, because we're going to be going through this rather quickly here, and you don't have a screen here to see the verses that I'm referring to. And so first of all, we have the first 4 seals. And if you were listening to that, you notice those first 4 seals, they kind of all go together. What makes me think they go together? Because they're all people riding on horses. They're all somebody on a horse. In fact, you maybe even heard that phrase, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, again, there's one of those things where that language has given us a preconceived notion, because we hear apocalypse and what do we think? End of the world, asteroids falling, Bruce Willis saving us, all these incredible things going on. But apocalypse simply means unveiling or revealing. And so we have to ask, what are we seeing with these 4 horsemen and what happens with them? And so I think they go together for a couple reasons. One is they kind of the way they fit, and they're all similar. Also, again, I mentioned Old Testament. The book of Zechariah also has pictures of 4 horsemen. And so we see these together. And we also think of, in the throne room, there were the 4 living creatures. And so there's this kind of contrast between the horsemen and the creatures. But we have to ask ourselves the right question as we start. The question we may want to ask is, who are these horsemen? Or how will they know what they are? When will we see them? But I think a better question is, what are they doing? Pay attention to what they're doing. So we have the first rider in verse 2. It says, I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror, bent on conquest. What's the first rider all about? Conquering, right? Here's this rider. This rider represents the nations of the world. I mean, this is what, there's somebody out there, I'm going to go conquer them. These are the kings and the princes and the rulers, the dictators, the emperors who look to seek and make conquest. So we see this horse riding out, bent on conquest. Second rider. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. So what's this rider doing? He's taking away peace. Well, how do you make it? If there's peace between you and your neighbor, you can hardly go conquer them, right? So this rider comes out and says, well, we're not going to allow peace, and we're going to make you kill each other. Next horse, verses 5 through 6. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, come. I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in its hands. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and wine. You think, well, wait a minute. I've got one riding out on conquest and one taking away peace and one making them kill each other. Now all of a sudden I got somebody with a scale, and what's going on? Well, what happens in times of war? So the other day, Christine was just showing me from her grandparents and her mom ration books from World War II. These little books so during the wartime, you could only buy a certain amount of goods. And you had a little book, and it could tell you could take a little stamp in, and that got you your milk or your coffee or your sugar. That's exactly what happens at wartime. There's limited resources, and there aren't so much. And so this horse, it says 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages. In other words, 2 pounds of wheat is about what you'd eat in a day. So in other words, you're spending an entire day's wages just to buy your food for the day. But notice what's not affected, the oil and the wine. Well, who gets the oil and the wine? The rich people, right? So in other words, when war happens, who suffers? The poor. And the rich, well, they just continue on. So now we come to the fourth horse. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse, and its rider was named Death, and Hades was following on. Hades is the grave. So death comes along, and where do you go when you die? To the grave. And they were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So all these things that go along with war. Because war doesn't just affect the economy, people die. And so what we see as these four horsemen is basically the history of the world. If you go back through the history of the world, when have the four horsemen not been riding? When have there not been wars going on? In fact, the 21st century, this century we live in, by some estimates, is the most war-torn century of any time. Just wars going on, and we forget about them. We know about the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, but there are other places like Sudan and Congo where wars have been going on for decades, and people dying and people suffering. And so John is seeing this picture of these horses riding out and saying, this is world history going on. This is a chain of events we know well. But I also want you to notice the language that gets used here, because this is important. Do the riders just ride out on their own? No, they ride out when what? When a voice says, come. And then there's this language. So each time a voice, and the voice comes from where? Towards the throne, one of the living creatures. And then there's this language of, and he was given a crown, and he was given a sword, and he was given scales, and he was told to say. And that's Bible speak for God gave to him. So when you see that sort of passive voice, and it was given to him, we see the horses, they don't come out except at the control of God. In other words, we'll say that this way, we got to be careful. War is a result of sin, but sin is always under the kingship of the crucified Christ. That God is sovereign. Remember the previous chapter, God was sitting on the throne. God is in control even when there's war going on. And so George Caird says it this way. Oops. Hang on. My computer's not cooperating very well here. Grab my... He says, rather, the voice is declaring that nothing can now happen, not even the most fearsome evidence of man's disobedience and its nemesis, which cannot be woven into the pattern of God's gracious purpose. So what we see is that even though all these things are happening, it's all part of God's purpose. And so we're going to keep this in mind. So now we've had these first four seals are open. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 horsemen riding down, bringing war and famine and plague on the earth. But now the scene changes when we come to the 5th seal. And this is what happens when the 5th seal is opened. We see the people who have been killed for their faith. It says in verse 10, they called out in a loud voice, how long? So verse 9, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had been maintained. And then they called out in a loud voice, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? So now we get a shift, and we get this group of people, followers of Jesus, Christians who have been killed because of their faith. And they're surrounding the throne. And what are they calling out? How long? Not how long till the end of the earth, but how long till you avenge us? In other words, how long until you bring justice to the earth? They're suffering out. They're crying out. They've suffered at the hands of Babylon. They've suffered at the hands of these wars. They've suffered at all the different things going on. And they want to hear from God. They want to hear from God what is going on because they realize there needs to be justice in the world. If there's not justice, then God's name is dishonored. If his servants die without being avenged, then God's reputation is damaged. So a question for us is, how are our prayers like these? I mean, when was the last time you cried out, how long, O Lord, till I'm avenged? We don't like to think about it that way. But if we think about not as God's vengeance as this bloody thing coming down to Christ, but God's vengeance or his justice or his judgment as what? Bringing justice to the earth. That's putting an end to evil. And in fact, we see them answered at the end of chapter 8, or at the beginning of chapter 8, verse 1 through 5. So this is Revelation 8, verses 4 and 5. The smoke of the incense, or I'm going to start actually with verse 3. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. So here's an angel with the prayers going up as incense to God. Now listen, the smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. All right, so prayers for what? Prayers for vengeance, prayers for justice going up to the throne. Now listen, then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it to the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. So there's these prayers that go up from God's people, and God responds. God responds with justice. God responds with what? Destruction of evil, with the eradication of evil. So God knows what's going on. Other interesting thing in this passage is he says, then each of them was given a white robe. This is verse 11. And they were told to wait a little while longer. Here they are. They're suffering. They've died for their faith. But they say, just wait a little while longer. Well, they're kind of like, you would say, well, how much longer? Well, till the full number of your fellow servants, your brothers and sisters, are killed. In other words, more people are going to die. I mean, how would that make you feel? Like, oh, I died for my faith. Are you going to bring vengeance, God? No, we got a few more to die still. In other words, there's this plan that's going on, and suffering belongs to this, but also that God knows the number. God knows how much is going on. Then we come to the next one. So that's the fifth seal. So we got 4 seals with the horsemen. Then we got the 5th seal kind of showing the people around the throne crying out. I want you to remember how long. And then the 6th one, as I watched as he opened the 6th seal, there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black. The whole moon turned blood red. The stars in the sky fell to the earth. The heavens receded like a scroll, and every mountain and island was removed. You think, well, why is he counting? How many things happen? 7. And again, if you're kind of new with us, we've been doing this 7 things. 7 represents completeness. So we have what certainly sounds like the end of the world. Because it says the stars in the sky fell to earth. What do we call a star in the sky falling to earth? It's not a meteor, is it? How big is a star? Is it smaller than the earth or bigger than the earth? Bigger by a whole lot, right? So if all the stars in the sky fell to the earth, how much of the earth would be left? Not much. I mean, this sounds, I mean, these are the kind of language that Jesus uses to describe the end of the world. This is the kind of words that the prophets use to describe the end of the world. And you say, wait a minute, we're only in chapter 6. How can we be at the end of the world? We're going to talk more about that next week. Because the way I understand Revelation is it does these cycles. It repeats. It's a lot like music, where it goes up and it builds and then it repeats and it comes back and it builds up and it repeats and it builds up and it intensifies each time. And so we see this picture of these things happening where the sun turned black, the moon turns red, the stars sky fell to the earth, the heavens recede like a scroll. The heavens are gone. And every mountain and island was removed from its place. So all these things go on and we say, that sounds like the end of the world. And even when the seventh seal is open and there's silence, there's pictures of judgment. So we have all these things happening, and then we have a group of people. And I want you to count them. We have the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, the slave, and the free. Look at that. 7 times again. And they're sitting there and they're saying, they hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And you might say, wait a minute, how can they be hiding in the mountains? Because we've just been told what? The mountains are moved, they're gone. Because this is all happening at the same time. So this word then is in some sense a picture of how John sees it. And they called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And then this line, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? The great day of their wrath. That certainly sounds, again, that's end of the world. The day of the Lord. So, what I want us to notice is that question. NIV translated, who can withstand it? I think a better way is to, who can stand? So all these things are going on. In other words, who can withstand it? You hear those words are very similar, but who can stand? How are we going to be able to withstand all these things going on? What all things going on? Sun turning black, moon turning red, stars falling to the sky, mountains and islands being removed. Who can endure that? And what we find is Revelation does this interesting thing. And if you read, as we read through it, you'll notice this. So we have 3 sets of 7 judgments. There's, first of all, these seals, and then there's trumpets, then there's bowls. But each time as we read through them, after the 6th one, so now we've just opened the 6th seal, there's kind of a commercial break. Or we could call it an interlude, because all of a sudden it shifts. And the interludes are absolutely essential for understanding. And you even see, if your Bible has little headings, and I took them out of the thing there because I think they get confusing. But all of a sudden it changes, and we think, well, what's going on? But the interludes are absolutely crucial for helping us understand what's going on and what can go on. And so actually most scholars count 10 of these interludes in there. And here's 2 of them. Because I think what the interludes are doing is, the interludes are helping us. Because if you're reading along with this, imagine yourself, you're one of the churches in the time of John. And you're listening to this, and John is telling you, this is what is going to happen. There's going to be these 4 riders that are going out, and there's going to be one on a black horse, and one on a red horse, and one on a pale horse, and there's going to be death and famine and wars and plagues. And they're like, oh, and you're starting to get a little bit worried. It's like, and a bunch of you are going to die because of your testimony. And then probably even more of you are going to die because of your testimony. Because God has a number and a plan for it. And then the stars are going to begin falling from the sky, and the mountains are going to be hurled away, and the islands are going to be hurled away. And you're like, starting to get a little worried, aren't you? A little bit of nervous. And what these interludes do is they kind of give you a break. And what they do is they take you up from all this chaos and this horror, and they bring you out. And Scott McKnight again says this. He says, this is what the interludes do. They lift the listeners in the 7 churches out of the horrors of the dragon and the wild things in Babylon into the heavenly throne room to experience God as the real story behind the story of everything. In other words, what these interludes do is they give us a break. They give us a chance to say, wait a minute, in all this chaos and all these things going on, I want you to see what's really going on here. I want you to know what's going on and that it's not quite as bad as it seems. So we just ended, so we're going to move ahead to chapter 7. But chapter 6 ended, or what we call chapter 6 ended with what? Everything going on, and these kings and the princes and all these people crying out, what? Who can stand? Who can survive all this? And now we get this answer. Because we start chapter 7, and we see the 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth. And then it says, then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. And you think, wait a minute. Don't harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on their foreheads? What did we just hear? Stars raining down, mountains and islands flying, which tells us we can't just read the book of Revelation as a chronological roadmap that goes, event chapter 6 happens, then chapter 7, because it's right there in this text. John's seeing a different picture and he's saying, don't harm the land or the sea or the trees. Well, there was just a whole bunch of harm going on. So now we're going back again. Fancy word, recapitulation. It's going around and it's repeating. And we hear this number and they're placed and they're given a seal. And it's description of these people putting a seal on their forehead. We're not necessarily meant to envision a literal stamp on their head, but the seal is what? Seal is a mark of safety, of protection. Well, what sort of protection? Well, we just heard some of them died, right? So they're not being protected from dying. What are they being protected from? Ultimate judgment. They're being protected from ultimate death. And again, here's one of those places where we could go down lots of rabbit trails. We're not going to go down a lot of those, but we see there's 144,000. So math is 144,000 is 12 times 12. 12 is this number that represents the tribes of Israel and the apostles. 12 times 12, 144. And then 1,000 is 10 times 10 times 10, this symbol of just a really big number of perfection. Now, who are these 144,000? Who knows? All right. It could be a lot of people. It could be a representation of Israel, of the Jewish people. It could represent the church here on earth, because here we see we're back on earth. Or it could be the same group as that's described a little bit later. And I think that's probably the best one. But it doesn't matter. We're not going to argue about that. But what we want to pay attention to is, what do we know about these people? They're sealed, which means they're protected, right? Clearly, there's symbolism going on and this sense of what's going on. So now, we've got this 144,000 that have been sealed. And then after this, I looked, this is verse 9. And there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language. I never know how to use my fingers when I'm counting. Tribe, nation, language, people. 4, again, this all-encompassing 4 quarters of the earth, 4 worlds. And what were they doing? Standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And what was the question we just asked in the midst of the chaos? Who can stand? So now we have this interlude, and it's telling us that there's a group of people from every nation, tribe, language, and people standing before the throne. They're wearing white robes and are holding palm branches, and they're talking about salvation belongs to our God. In other words, these are people who have been saved. In fact, it goes on a little bit later because John says, who are they? That says, these are those who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. In other words, these are people who have put their faith in Jesus Christ, and they can stand. Verse 11, and then all the angels, what do you think the angels were doing? Standing before the throne. So we've just asked that question. We've had this chaos of stars raining down, mountains and islands getting blown away, the sun turning black, the moon turning red. The world is falling apart, and people are asking the question, who can stand? And we're given this little interlude this little break, and the question is answered. In fact, we're going to see this in the coming weeks with the same thing with the trumpets and with the bowls. There's questions that are answered, and the interludes answer the questions. They help us understand the seals. They help us understand the trumpets. They help us understand the bowls. In this case, they help us understand the seals. Because we've seen there's war, there's famine, there's pestilence, then there's the martyrdom, the execution of Christians, then there's the end of the world with the stars and the mountains and islands, all this stuff going on, and the question of who can stand. And we might be wondering, who can stand among them? What can happen? And then we're taken up to the throne room to heaven, and we can say, I'll tell you who can stand. There's these people who have been sealed with the mark of God. There are those who've had their robes washed in the blood of the Lamb. There are the angels standing around. In other words, who can stand? The servants of God. That's who can stand. That's what we want to know, is what they all have in common. So we can look and we can try and pick apart all these different questions and symbols and say, well, why has he got a pale horse, and why has he got a red horse, and why does this one have a black horse? And pale horse actually probably means a green horse, which is really bizarre, but this is what's happening, and there's all these strange things going on and all this catastrophic language. But the question to ask is, who can stand? Who's going to be able to endure? How? Or maybe we're asking, how can I endure all that? Because this is history. How can I endure through all this? And this is the thing. Who can stand? The servants of God. The ones who've been sealed. The ones who've had their robes washed in the blood. The ones who've given their life to Jesus. The angels who are the servants of God. They're the ones who can stand. And so that's the message we're invited to hear, is we can try and figure out all those other things. We can try and maybe look forward and say, well, maybe this is the horse and this is that horse, and we can try and understand all those symbols. One little thing on that. For 2,000 years, people have been taking the symbols, the images, the stories in the book of Revelation and lining them up with events in history. You can go back 1,000 years ago and they can say, well, here's this event happening and here's this event happening. And one of the things that teaches me is one of two things. Either they're all wrong, or two, these are just pictures of what it's like all through history. These aren't just uniquely something that's going to happen sometime off in the future. It's something that's always happening. And so there's this picture of, we're moving through history, we come to the end, and then we go back and we're going to do the same thing with the trumpets. Then we're going to go back and do the same things with the bowls. And then with the other images, this kind of recapitulation, this building up, and each time it's going to get a little more intense, a little more intense, a little more intense, until the very end, when we're going to have the end in this incredible vision of the new Jerusalem coming down. But in the meantime, the people of God are asking, with all that's going on in the world, the early Christians who are there, who know Rome as the four horses, who enforce with the powers of the legions, and they've experienced that force of war. Go back, if you are a history buff, go back and read the Jewish histories. The events between about 60 AD and about 140 AD. It is horrendous. The slaughter that happened to the Jewish people during those periods, to the followers of Jesus during those periods. And so they know well what this looks like. These early listeners to John's revelation heard the stories of the Roman Empire as they marched on Jerusalem and sacked the city and destroyed the temple, and they surrounded Jewish people at Masada and at Gamla and slaughtered them to the last man, woman, and child. They know the stories of their fellow Christians being taken to the Colosseum and being clothed with animal skins so that the beasts like the lions and the bears will come and will maul them. They know the stories of their fellow Christians being lit alive to serve as torches for banquets for the Roman imperials. So they know these stories, and they're asking the question, who can stand amidst that? And the vision of Jesus says, here's the answer. Who can stand? Those who have been sealed, those who have washed their robes in the blood, those who are the servants of God. That's who can stand. So I want to suggest to you this. How can you hear these words today? One way you might hear these words is maybe you're looking around the world. You're looking on your computer, or you're reading your newspaper, or listening to the radio, or maybe the television, and you're seeing a world that's in chaos, where there are wars going on and rumors of war, all these things going on, and you're wondering what in the world is happening. And you might need to be reminded from this passage that God is still in control. Because remember what happened? Those 4 horsemen, they came only because the Lamb and the 4 living creatures allowed them to come. They were only able to do what they did because they were given that power. That God is overseeing all of those things. He's not in charge. I mean, he's not the one responsible, but he's overseeing, and they're not outside of his control. So what you may need to hear that moment when you turn on the news and you're just panicking, 2 things. One, you just maybe turn the news off. Okay, that's not a bad thing to do. This is, honestly, I know for myself, sometimes I read the news, I follow stories too much, and it just bothers me. I get upset and I get worried, and then I start to dislike certain people because I'm reading the news. If the news is causing you to not love your neighbor, if the news is causing you anxiety and pain, simple solution, key from your pastor, turn it off. Because I tell you what, it's not going to be any different next week. It's like a soap opera. Somebody once described it. It's like a soap opera. If you remember soap operas from like the 80s and 90s, like you could literally walk away for 2 years and come back. It's the same story, right? The news is the same way. If it's causing you anxiety, if it's causing you to worry, if it's causing you, again, to not love your neighbor, turn it off. Read something encouraging like the book of Revelation. Where the sun will turn black and the stars will fall from the sky. But it's encouraging. Why? Because we're told that God is in control. So that's the first one. Second thing is that this text may call you to do, it may issue the challenge to cry out for justice. Remember those saints who are gathered around the throne and they're saying, "How long, O Lord, till our blood is avenged?" What they're calling for is justice in the world. They're calling for an eradication of evil. Is there evil in the world today? Absolutely. There's tons of it. And what this text is saying, it's okay to call out to God and say, "God, do something about this evil in the world. Do something about this evil in the world." And we're reminded in this passage that when you do that, your prayers rise up as incense before the throne of God. And there will be a moment when those prayers, our calls for justice, are gathered up into this censer and curled down. And again, an image, a picture, a symbol of how God's prayers, our prayers, are answered by God to bring justice to the earth. So it's okay to cry out for justice. In fact, it's not just okay, it's something we need to do. We did it earlier, and we didn't use those same languages. We said this prayer all together. We said, your kingdom come, your will be done. In other words, it's a cry for justice. Third thing, last thing, is how might we hear these words? It might be the words that you need to hear and say, how can I stand? How am I going to be able to make it? How am I going to face the end of history? How am I going to face the trials of tomorrow? How am I going to face all the challenges? I mean, it's ultimately looking forward to the end of history. How can I stand before God on the judgment day? But it's also, how can I stand in the midst of the trials? The way to stand is through Jesus Christ. Through being sealed by him, through being washed in his blood, by putting our faith, by putting our trust in him. That's the way to stand. And so if you're wondering, you say, how am I going to face all of these things going on in history? How am I going to endure the wars? How am I going to stand before God on the last day when the mountains and islands are being removed from their place, when the sun is turned black and the stars are falling in the sky? How am I going to stand before God? By putting my trust and my faith in Jesus Christ. So we see all these strange and bizarre symbols happening in the midst of the seals. But the question is, who can stand? And the ones who can stand are the servants of God. The ones who live for the Lamb, the one who have put their trust in him. So may we be his servants. May we put our faith and trust in the Lamb so that we can stand on the last day. Amen.